All right, so today we are diving deep into the world of survey research. And I think this is something that should be interesting for anyone who wants to understand how we know what people think and do. Whether you're prepping for a research project or just want to be a more informed reader of all those polls and studies we see all the time.
Yeah.
So to get us started, we have some excerpts from a psych textbook chapter on survey research.
Excellent. Yeah, so we'll be drawing from that. And it's interesting because good survey research really aims to get those insights that are both reliable and valid. And you can use that to inform everything from public policy to marketing strategies.
Yeah, for sure. So to kick things off, let's think about this question. If we want to know what people think, you just ask them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty straightforward, but it's a little more nuanced than that. Like imagine you're trying to understand what Americans' music preferences are, but you only survey country music fans and you only survey them in Nashville. That's going to give you a very skewed picture, right? And that's why sampling is so important.
I see what you're saying. So you can't ask everyone, so you need a smaller group. But how do you make sure that smaller group really reflects the whole population?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? And that's where probability sampling comes in. It's all about making sure everyone in that population has a known chance of being selected, which helps to minimize bias. Think of it like drawing names out of a hat.
Okay, so a lottery system for research participants. But let's be real, not every survey is going to be that perfect random sample. Our source material mentions some pretty dramatic examples, like that one call-in survey about the UN. Hundreds of thousands of people responded. But it was totally misleading because the sample was so off.
Exactly. Having a huge sample size doesn't mean much if it's not reflecting the population you want to study. That's why researchers often use things like stratified random sampling to make sure they're capturing the right proportions of different subgroups. Like if you're studying college students, you'd want to make sure you have the right mix of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors.
That makes sense. Okay. So we've got our group of people. What's next? How do we actually ask the questions? I'm picturing stacks of paper surveys, but I'm guessing things have changed a bit.
You're right, yeah. The days of relying solely on mail surveys are over. Now researchers have a whole toolkit, like personal interviews, telephone interviews, and of course, internet surveys.
Okay, let's unpack that. Mail surveys, convenient, anonymous. But I would guess those low response rates could really skew things. It's like if you tried to judge a movie based only on reviews from people who loved it or hated it.
Exactly. You lose all those nuanced perspectives in the middle. Now, with personal interviews, you get richer data, and you can clarify anything that's confusing. But they can be really expensive and time-consuming.
And then there's that risk of interviewer bias, too, right? If an interviewer accidentally leads the participant to certain answers, our source material really stresses how important training and supervision are to minimize that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Telephone interviews give you a bit more control, but they can also be prone to interviewer bias. Plus, you're limited to people with phones, which may not represent everyone.
And then there's online surveys. Huge potential there. But I bet there's some biases lurking, too.
Yeah, you gotta be careful. Internet surveys can be great for reaching big, diverse groups quickly, but you have to watch out for selection bias because not everyone has internet. And then you lose control over the environment. Who knows what else someone is doing while taking your survey?
Oh, I know I've been guilty of multitasking while taking a survey or two. Not the most focused respondent. So it seems like you really have to weigh the pros and cons of each survey method to choose the right one.
Yeah, for sure. It's all about getting the most reliable data for your needs. Now, once you've got your method, you need to think about the overall design. Do you want just a snapshot in time, or are you interested in changes over time?
So it's not just the questions, it's how the whole survey is structured to get those answers. Our source talks about three main designs: cross-sectional, successive independent samples, and longitudinal.
Yeah, let's break this down. So cross-sectional gives you one snapshot in time. Great for current attitudes and making predictions, but it doesn't tell you how things might change over time. It's like taking one picture of a busy street. You capture that moment, but you don't know where those people came from or where they're going.
Oh, I see. So it's static, not dynamic. What about successive independent samples?
That's where you take multiple snapshots over time, but with different groups each time. So it's like taking a picture of that street every year. You see how the scene changes, but you don't know if it's the same people walking by.
Our source mentions that study of college freshman values since the 1960s. By surveying different groups of freshmen each year, researchers were able to see how values shifted over time.
Yeah, and that's a great way to see big cultural changes. Now, if you want to see how individuals change over time, You'd need a longitudinal design. It's like a time-lapse video of that street. You can see how individual people move and change.
There's a study in our source about women's eating attitudes over 20 years using that design. It revealed subtle patterns in how attitudes changed over time, something you couldn't see with the other designs.
Right, longitudinal designs give you a deeper understanding of change, but they are the most demanding to do.
So we've covered asking the questions, designing the study. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about the questions themselves, even with good sampling and design. If you have a badly worded question, it can throw everything off,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Writing a good questionnaire is a science and an art. It's way more complex than people think.
So what goes into making a good questionnaire?
Well, the first thing is figuring out exactly what information you need. Then comes drafting and revising, often getting feedback from experts. You also want to pre-test your questions with a similar group to catch any confusing parts. Then finally, it's editing and making sure you have clear procedures for giving the survey.
Sounds like a lot of work goes into it before you even collect data.
Oh yeah, for sure. And actually, you should plan your data analysis before you even write the questions.
That makes sense. Got to make sure you can actually use the data you get.
Yeah.
So what about wording those questions? Seems simple, but I bet it's trickier than it seems.
Yeah, you're right. One thing is to use clear, simple language. But even seemingly basic questions can be tricky. Like if you ask, what is your race? That can get complicated quickly. People might confuse race and ethnicity. Or there might be nuances within those categories that your question doesn't capture.
Wow, so even simple questions can be hard. What about those loaded questions we always hear about?
Ah, yeah, those are designed to get a specific response, like they use emotional language or frame the question in a leading way.
Like if you ask someone, do you agree that all politicians are corrupt?
Exactly. You want your questions to be neutral and to avoid any wording that might push people toward a certain answer.
So no ambiguous language, no leading questions. What else should we avoid?
Well, you want your questions to be concise and easy to follow, and make sure any information people need is given up front. The order of your questions matters too. You generally want to start broad and then get more specific. Those are called funnel questions.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like having a conversation. You start with general topics and then go deeper as you go. So it's like a well-choreographed dance, guiding the respondent through the topics in a clear, engaging, and unbiased way.
I like that analogy. It's all about keeping people engaged without leading them to any particular answers.
This is making me feel way more prepared to tackle those surveys I see.
Mm.
But before we get too confident, there's the question of honesty. How do we know people are telling the truth on surveys? What about that social desirability bias? I know I've answered questions based on what I thought sounded good, not what I really thought.
Oh yeah, I think we've all done that. It's a valid concern. Surveys rely on self-reported data, so we're trusting that people are being honest. But just like in everyday life, we generally trust people's responses unless we have a reason not to.
So we should be aware of the potential for bias. But we don't have to dismiss everything as unreliable.
Exactly. Our source material says one way to be more confident is to compare survey data to other info, like behavior observations.
So it's like triangulation, using multiple sources to get a more complete picture. But even with a good survey and honest answers, there's a big question. Can surveys tell us about cause and effect?
Ah, the million-dollar question. And the short answer is not always. We've all heard that correlation does not equal causation. And that's something to remember when looking at survey data.
Our source makes that point too. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. It could be something else entirely. Like the classic example. Ice cream sales and drownings both go up in the summer. Obviously, ice cream doesn't cause drownings.
Right. There's a third variable there, hot weather, that's influencing both. We call that a spurious relationship.
Spurious. So if correlational research can't prove cause and effect, what's the point?
It's still really valuable for finding potential causes and coming up with hypotheses for more research. It's a starting point for investigation.
I see. So it's a clue that points us in the right direction. So how do researchers try to figure out cause and effect from correlational data?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and we'll be exploring that in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into survey research. Last time, we got into sampling, questionnaire design, and even that correlation versus causation problem.
Right, and we were just getting to the juicy stuff. How do researchers actually try to untangle cause and effect when all they have is correlations?
Well, one tool they use is called path analysis. It helps tease out those cause and effect relationships, even from correlational data. It involves figuring out what are called mediator variables and moderator variables.
Okay, hold on. Break that down for me. What are those? So let's say researchers are studying how poverty affects kids. They might find that poverty is correlated with, let's say, psychological distress in kids. But they wouldn't stop there.
So they wouldn't just say poverty causes distress and be done.
No way. They want to understand why. So they might find that chaos in the home environment is a mediator variable. Poverty often leads to more chaos, and more chaos is linked to more distress.
Okay, so the chaos is like the middleman. Poverty leads to chaos, which then leads to distress.
Exactly. And by understanding that mediator chaos, researchers can get a much better picture of what's really going on.
That's so interesting. What about those moderator variables? You said they tell us when and for whom a relationship holds true.
Right. So a moderator variable can actually change how strong or what direction a relationship goes. Like, let's say researchers are studying exercise and happiness. They might find, in general, more exercise, more happiness.
Sure, makes sense. Get those endorphins going. But would that be true for everyone?
Maybe not, and that's where the moderator comes in. They might find that the link between exercise and happiness is stronger for people who like to exercise. So enjoyment would be the moderator. It changes how strong that relationship is.
So if you hate running, it's not going to make you happy, even if it's good for your body.
Exactly. Or they might find that relationship is stronger for people who are already pretty healthy. So health status could be another moderator.
Wow, so moderators can really show you the little details within a bigger relationship. It's not just a one-size-fits-all thing.
Exactly. And by knowing those moderators, researchers can start to give more specific advice, tailored to different people.
So it's not just, is there a link, but what does that link depend on? This is getting pretty complex.
It is, and that's what makes survey research so cool. It's not just numbers, it's about telling a story with those numbers. But of course, like any research with people, we have to think about ethics.
Right. It's not just about getting the answers. It's about getting them responsibly.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the ethical guidelines for survey research?
One of the biggest ones is informed consent. People have a right to know what they're getting into before they say yes to participating. So you have to tell them clearly what the survey is about, what you'll do, and any risks involved.
So no surprises or hidden agendas.
Exactly. And they can also quit at any time without any problem. And if you're asking about sensitive stuff, you have to be extra careful about keeping things anonymous and confidential.
So people feel safe sharing their information.
Absolutely. Researchers have to keep that data safe and make sure no one can be identified or harmed.
This makes me think about those different survey methods. Some might be better for sensitive topics than others, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like mail surveys are really good for sensitive stuff.
Yeah.
Because they're anonymous. People can fill them out privately and send them back without giving their name.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about online surveys? They can be anonymous, but I bet there are some challenges there.
Yeah, you're right to be careful. With online surveys, researchers have to be really careful about data security. They have to take steps to keep that info safe.
So it's not just about being anonymous, it's about keeping the data secure too.
Right, and then there's also the issue of potential harm. Some topics can be really upsetting, and researchers need to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, first do no harm.
Exactly. Researchers have to think about the risks and try to minimize any negative impacts. If there's a chance someone might get upset, they should offer support or referrals to other services.
That's good to know. So it sounds like ethics are part of every step of survey research.
They should be. It's not just about rules, it's about treating people with care and respect.
Well said. So even with ethical research, interpreting results can be tricky, right? It's not just numbers in, answers out.
Yeah, it's rarely that simple. One challenge is generalizability. Can we be sure that what we found in our sample is true for everyone? This goes back to sampling. If your sample isn't representative, your findings might not be true for the whole population.
So even with perfect data collection, we can't overgeneralize.
Exactly. And we also need to think about the context. When and where was the survey done? Were there any outside things that might have affected the answers?
That's a good point. Like, if you ask about politics right before an election, you'll probably get different answers than if you ask when things are calmer.
Exactly. Timing and context can make a huge difference. And then we also need to remember the limits of self-reported data.
Ah, yes, that social desirability bias again.
Right. People don't always tell the whole truth, especially about things that are sensitive or could make them look bad.
And what people say they do and what they actually do aren't always the same either. Our source talks about that study on the bystander effect, where people thought they would act one way, But when researchers actually observed them, they did something totally different.
That's a classic example. It shows why it's good to use different methods and different sources of info to get the most complete picture.
So we should look at survey data with a critical eye, recognizing that it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that leads us to the next challenge. How do we use these results?
Right, it's not just about knowing what people think. It's about using that knowledge to make things better.
You got it. Surveys can help inform policy, interventions, even marketing, but we can't oversimplify the findings or jump to conclusions.
So no assuming correlation equals causation.
Right. We have to use the data carefully, knowing its limits and potential biases, and thinking about the bigger context and any unintended consequences.
So just because a survey says people want something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Right. Well, there might be other factors, like is it even possible? How would it affect different people? Could it have bad side effects?
So surveys are a starting point for discussion, not a final answer.
Exactly. You have to combine the findings with other information, expert opinions, and careful thought.
This has been really eye-opening. There's so much more to survey research than I realized.
It is a fascinating field.
It's not just about asking questions. It's about asking the right ones, the right way, and then using those answers thoughtfully.
You got it. And that's what makes it so powerful for understanding the world.
I'm starting to see that. But before we wrap up this part, let's talk about how surveys are used in the real world.
Oh yeah, there are so many ways. From public opinion to marketing to social trends to science.
Our source even mentions a study on how smoking in movies affects teens, showing how surveys can shape public health efforts.
Great example. It shows how surveys can have a real impact.
It's inspiring to see how this research can be used for such important things.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final part of this deep dive. We'll talk about some common misunderstandings about surveys, go over some key takeaways, and leave you with some things to think about, so stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into surveys. We've talked about everything from asking the right questions to making sense of the answers.
We have, and we even touched on those tricky ethical considerations. But like with any field, there are always those myths and misunderstandings floating around. So before we wrap up, let's bust a few of those myths about survey research.
Okay, I'm ready to do some myth busting. What's the first one on our list?
Well, a big one is that a huge sample size means you've got accurate results. Remember that call-in survey about the UN we talked about? Tons of responses, but totally misleading because the sample was so off.
Right, it's like that saying, garbage in, garbage out. You can have mountains of data, but if it's based on a bad sample, it's worthless.
Exactly. It's not just about how many, it's about who those numbers represent. Quality over quantity every time.
Right, so big sample size doesn't mean accuracy. What's another myth we hear?
Oh, this one's common. That surveys give you the absolute truth about people's attitudes and behaviors.
That sounds a little too good to be true. Are there limits to what surveys can really tell us?
You're right to be skeptical. We have to remember that survey data is subjective. It's colored by how people see things, their experiences, and even that social desirability bias we talked about.
Right, it's like trying to measure happiness. Everyone experiences it differently. So a single survey question can only tell you so much.
Exactly. And don't forget, people's answers can change depending on all sorts of things, like how the questions are worded, the context, even their mood that day.
That makes me think of those longitudinal studies, where you're tracking people over time.
Yeah.
Those must be especially tough to interpret with all those individual changes happening.
They definitely are. Researchers have to be very careful. Is it a real change in attitude or just a temporary blip? It's a tricky puzzle.
I could see why researchers spend their careers on this stuff. It's fascinating.
It is. And that brings us to another misconception, where people take survey findings too far, like jumping to conclusions about cause and effect or applying the results to groups that weren't even in the study.
So like those headlines that say, survey says everyone hates broccoli,
Yeah.
when really it was just a small group of picky eaters.
Exactly. Surveys are a powerful tool, but they're not the ultimate source of truth. There's always more to the story.
So we need to use our critical thinking skills when we see survey results, whether it's in the news, advertising, or even on social media.
Absolutely. Ask yourself those questions. Who did the survey? Who are the people? What were the questions? How did they analyze the data? And what are the limits of these findings?
Be a detective. Examine the evidence.
Yeah.
I'm feeling much more confident now about looking at those surveys with a critical eye.
That's great. So as we wrap up our deep dive into surveys, let's go over those key takeaways one more time. First, sampling is key. Remember those country music fans in Nashville? If you want good results, you need a sample that reflects everyone.
Right. It's all about representation. And we can't forget that correlation doesn't mean causation.
Exactly. Always think about other possibilities and explanations. And remember triangulation, using multiple sources to check your findings.
So look at things from different angles and be critical. And of course, there's the ethical side of things. Informed consent, anonymity, confidentiality. Those are crucial for doing research the right way.
Well said. We have to protect the people in our studies and make sure they're treated right.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I understand so much more about how surveys work.
It's been great having this conversation.
From now on, I'm going to look at those surveys I see with a whole new perspective.
That's fantastic. And remember, if you ever find yourself wondering about a poll or a study, think back to what we talked about today.
And as always, we'd love to hear from our listeners, so send us your thoughts, questions, or even your own survey stories.
We're always happy to keep the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of surveys.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious.